I had the great fortune of having Dr. George Goodheart as one of my first teachers, along with Dr. Wally Schmidt. It's like getting turned on to physics and somebody saying, oh, would you like to go study with Einstein and this other guy named Tesla? And I was working at a chiropractic office and doing body work. I started as a massage therapist, and they said, yeah, we're going up to study with George Goodheart and take his 100-hour course. So I got to hear a lot of the stories that I'm going to share with you from George himself. So it all started when he had a Christmas present of a book called Muscle Testing and Function from a fellow chiropractor. And he got the book and he goes, well, nice book. You can test muscles, but what good does that do if you find a muscle weak and all you can do is exercise it to strengthen it? So I put the book away, and he had this patient for a number of years who had a shoulder problem for like 15 years. And you can always ask, Doc, when are you going to fix my shoulder? When are you going to fix my shoulder? So he looked at the man's shoulder. He had anterior serratus. He found in the Muscle Testing and Function book that his scapula was protruding. And as you know, when the scapula protrudes, that is showing that the anterior serratus is probably weak. So Goodheart deduced that from reading the book. So he said, well, his name was Ronald. He said, Ronald, hold your arm up and I'm going to see if this muscle is weak on the shoulder side of the shoulder is having a problem. And sure enough, it was weak. Well, then he thought, well, now what? Well, he figured if a muscle's weak, it's probably atrophied. So he went and palpated, and you can all do this as you're watching. He palpated along, mine is tender, along the origin of the muscle, and he found these nodules there. So he kept rubbing on the nodules, and the nodules went away. So then he said, well, let's just see if anything happened. And he retests the muscle, and he finds it's tremendously strong. And so Ronald said, well, why didn't you do that earlier, Doc? And Goodheart had a great sense of humor. He says, well, you know, you had this problem for a while, and these things take time. Well, then he was amazed. He thought, maybe I'm onto something here. He brought the man back the next day, retested his arm, and it was strong. The man was wanting to get a job in the motor factories, and he couldn't because he couldn't pass his physical, but now he could because Dr. Goodheart fixed his shoulder. And he saw him from time to time over the years, and he said it maintained its strength. So Goodheart said, wow, I now have a technique to help people with problems. And he noticed that often when he would go through the body and test muscles in various areas, if someone had a shoulder problem, he'd test muscles there, or knee problem there, and he'd rub the origin insertion. And sometimes it would work, but sometimes it wouldn't. He had this other patient come to him who had severe sciatic pain. The only way he could relieve it was by walking. So as he's walking, he says, oh, the pain gets relieved, but it doesn't completely go away. So Goodhart's thinking, walking activates lymphatic flow. So the man, he tested his fascia lata, it was totally weak. So he said, let me just, tried the origin insertion, that didn't help. So he said, let me just rub the muscle. And he's rubbing along the iliotibial band to drain lymph. And the man says, why, Doc, that's the first relief I've ever had. And Goodheart would always say, well, that's what you come here for, but hiding his astonishment, right? So then he finds that there's by draining lymph, that's another way to help muscles. So we have the origin insertion technique and then something to do with lymphatics. Well, when he finally put it together, it was actually the next day, he said, his secretary, Charlotte, had often headaches, and she comes in with a sinus headache and says, oh, Doc, my head is really killing me. Well, he noticed that her neck was awry and that she had the neck muscles out of balance. So he says, okay, well, let's test your neck muscles, and sure enough, they're weak. So then he's doing the origin insertion, that doesn't help. He rubs the neck to try and drain lymph, but that doesn't help. But then he rubbed right under, and all you do this as I'm doing it here. He rubbed right on the second to third rib space here, about 2 inches out, and it was very tender. And as he's rubbing and rubbing, she's going, wow, Doc, should that have gotten rid of my headache? And he goes, yeah, that sounds good. And so he then figured out that her sinus headache was relieved by working points here that he observed in another book he had called Chapmans Reflexes. So those are now known as neurolymphatic points, as we use all the time. So he then added to the origin insertion technique, oh, we have these points called neurolymphatics, and not only did her headache go away, but her neck straightened. And he goes, the neck muscles are associated with the sinuses. So that was something he then discovered. There's a muscle-organ relationship. So he goes, wow, we're really on to something here. So from there, he started, by trial and error, going through and finding what muscles went with what organs. So it was started by muscles and organs. In trial and error, he would test a muscle, and then he would rub various neurolymphatic points, and often they'd be tender, because the more a point needs to be worked, the more tender it is. So he finds lots of organs and muscle relationship. And he noticed that if someone came in with a diagnosis of organ dysfunction, like liver challenges, heart, or maybe kidney, that they would have the muscle that he found associated with it would be weak. Say like psoas, if they had kidney challenges, or let's say lung, they'd have anterior serratus. So he put all that together. And he did say, though, if a muscle was weak, it didn't necessarily mean that the organ was in dysfunction. But if the organ was in dysfunction, you would find a weak muscle. So he's now put something else together called the opposing muscle theory. And this was another foundation of kinesiology that we all know, is when a muscle is tight and in spasm, let's just say like your upper trap, it's actually commonly the opposing muscle, the latissimus dorsi, that's weak. So rather than working on tight muscles, he would find where the weak muscles were and then switch them on. Now, so far he had origin insertion and neurolymphatic. So the next technique he discovered was Chapmans reflexes, which we call neurovascular points. Now, these neurovascular points are points on the head. We know about those. When he found this out when he was working on a man, he was teaching a seminar, and they brought this man, he was like 21 years old, and he was having a severe asthma attack. And he was wheezing and couldn't catch his breath. So Goodheart thinks asthma, that's related to the adrenal glands. So he checks the sartorius, it's weak. He rubs the origin, doesn't help. He rubs the neurolymphatics, it doesn't help. So he went to the sagittal suture for some reason. He's holding the man's sagittal suture, and where his little fingers were on the posterior fontanelle, he noticed a pulsation, and it was at 72 beats per minute. And he's thinking, that's strange. His heart's beating at 105 beats a minute. So he keeps holding these points, the neurovasculars that he later figured out, and as he's holding the points, the man stops wheezing, he takes a deep breath and goes, and it abates his asthma attack. Now, Goodheart, who was an avid reader, knew there was books by Chapman. I mean, that was Bennett, actually. And Bennett, Terence Bennett, was a chiropractor in San Francisco in the 1930s who figured out that there were all these points on the head that would stimulate blood flow. So he now thought, oh, Bennett's reflexes, which are outlined for organs, also connect. So then he said, through trial and error, let's check the points that go to various organs. Like we know the stomach, brain, and bladder are the frontal eminences. You can touch those with me right now. And then we also have, another great one is the parietal ridge. That's for large intestine, for the reproductive organs, and small intestine. So that stimulates blood flow, but he said it also activates muscles. So now we have three switches: origin insertion, neurolymphatic, neurovasculars. Well, the next discovery that comes along is the cranials. Now, in this case, Goodheart had a woman that was a 49-year-old Italian woman, came to Goodheart, and she had chronic headaches for 29 years due to a head injury. There's no way she can get rid of these from any other doctor. And Goodheart noticed a puzzling occurrence. Her muscles tested weak on her right side, many of them, and they became strong when she breathed in. And then he tested, oh, they're strong. Now, the muscles on the left side that were weak, they would become strong when she exhaled. Goodheart knew of the work of William Sutherland, who was an osteopath who postulated that the cranial bones move with respiration like gills of a fish. So what he did was he started palpating on the mastoid process, and he pushed forward on that as she breathed in, and then back on the right one when she breathed out. And he did this 5 times, and she looked at him in amazement and said, "Why, Doc, that's the first relief I've gotten in 29 years. And Goodheart, as he would often do, said, "That's what you come here for." And of course, he was astounded. Oh my God, there's some aspect of cranial work that affects the muscle strength and the energy flow within the body. So he went further to discover there's 14 cranial faults, and along with that, noticing how the spine and sacrum move with respiration. So we had another technique along with origin insertion, neurolymphatic, neurovascular, and working on the cranium. Goodheart made a further discovery that acupressure points can affect muscle flow. He was reading a book by Felix Mann called Acupuncture, the Ancient Chinese Art of Healing and How It Works Scientifically. I have a copy of that book. And in there, Felix Mann talks about acupressure holding points that are now part of Touch for Health and AK and other systems. And he noticed when he would hold points for certain meridians that would strengthen or tonify, that the person had the muscles that were associated particularly with an organ, like the stomach, they would strengthen when he did this tonification points for the stomach. Then he saw, oh, but if I do the sedation points for a meridian, a strong muscle that's related to that organ would also go weak because the organs and meridians connect. So now he had another set of points, knowing that, hey, when you work with the meridian system, you actually are affecting muscles that are associated with that. So we now have that. And again, if you look at the folio, the Touch for Health folio, you have heart, and then there's a muscle associated with that. And then if we go further, let's say bladder, and there's the muscles associated with the bladder. Now, the great thing that and I'll talk about Dr. Thie in a bit, he came up with how to map this out on these charts where you got the neurovascular point, you've got the neurolymphatic points, you've got the meridian, you've got the acupressure holding points. So they're all listed here along with, you can see the muscles to get the origins insertions. So we have all this wonderful information. The Goodheart was just one discovery led to another, led to another. Now there's the next thing he found out was there's a nutritional connection. And that's where they noticed, certain vitamins would strengthen a muscle. And again, if you look in the folio or the Touch for Health books here, you see it'll list a muscle and then the nutrition, like for the tibials, it's vitamin E, calcium, and trace minerals. For sacrospinalis, it's vitamins A and C. So they were doing this research. And I had the great privilege of working closely with Dr. Sheldon Deal, and he was talking about that. Yeah, when we were in the beginning, they would say, oh, let's experiment. Let's find out what supplements and vitamins and minerals relate to what muscle. And so they were mapping out all this, and this was like, groundbreaking frontier of kinesiology. This is like back in the 70s, early 70s. So we went from there to knowing that not only the vitamins, minerals, there's also herbs, Bach flower remedies, essential oils, cell salts. They're another way to switch on a muscle, and nutrient-rich foods. Now, he also found that foods that a person was sensitive to would test weak when they were put in their field. So there's a lot of biochemical kinesiology that's grown out of these original discoveries. Now, the emotional stress connection. Well, that's another great thing. What he found was a man, I think he was, this was in Colorado. He had been through the most tremendously stressful situation where he was driving down a mountain road and a Pontiac Bonneville came right at their car, almost hitting them, and then it went off the side of the cliff and crashed, and the guy died, apparently. Well, he's swerving to try and miss this, but he's got his family in the trailer behind him, and they're swerving, and he's like, oh my God, we're gonna crash, but he was able to finally get the car back on the road, and his family survived. Well, he goes to see Goodheart, and he was just shaking, like Parkinson's. And so Goodheart held his frontal eminences, the stress release points, and the man finally stops shaking and goes, oh, Doc, I feel so much better. So Goodheart realized, oh, these are key points for emotional stress release. So that became another groundbreaking technique that adds to our present body of knowledge. This all came then to bringing about the triad of health. The base of that triad being structure. Then we have biochemistry and the foods and nutrition, and another side, the emotional triad. So the emotional side. So we have these three that are always interacting with each other. And that's where a foundation, again, of Touch for Health and kinesiology and applied kinesiology is you want to approach the person holistically. And Goodheart used to tell us this in class. He'd say, where you think it is, it ain't. And he talked about, like, a lot of his executives, he worked in Detroit, Michigan, and had a lot of the motor company executives come to him. He said they often had low back pain, but it wasn't from structural imbalances, it was more from emotional stress. And he called it emotional low back. And then there was also people that would have, say, emotional issues, but it was biochemical, related to their neurotransmitters. And he found, like, working with B vitamins, how it would help schizophrenics. So sometimes the chemistry affects the emotions. And of course, the structure, when the structure is out, that can affect us biochemically and emotionally. So everything affects everything. So we always need to approach the whole person. So he founded that triad of health. Another thing he found was indicator muscle testing. And he saw that when you have a weak muscle, you can touch a switch like a neurolymphatic point, a neurovascular, maybe a meridian point that needs to be activated to correct that muscle, and it immediately goes strong. Now, another thing he discovered was that if you have a strong muscle and you touch an area that's under stress, it would go weak. So we use indicator muscles. Usually it's an anterior deltoid. Any muscle can be that. But that really helps us to get biofeedback information from the body. So he called it, when you touch an area, he called it therapy localization. It's like locating where you need to work to do therapy. In Touch for Health, we call it circuit locating, but it's the same thing. So that's another distinction that he discovered. And I once was riding on a bus at a Touch for Health conference to whatever cruise we were doing or whatever, and I got the chance to sit next to Wally Schmidt, and I said, what's like one of the biggest things you think ever came out of all the developments of kinesiology? And he said, therapy localization, that you can find out where you need to work. And that was one of his favorite things. Thanks for watching this video, and be sure to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more great content. And be sure to check out kinesiologyinstitute.com, where you can see all the courses we offer, both online as well as in person, to really advance your skills. Until then, God bless and be well.